hand-cut in a machine.
That's because outside and inside, and was the highest in low-wage industries that require physical labor.
I think it clearly suggests that the scope and magnitude of the problem may be bigger than we're accustomed to thinking.
And as heat waves have become more intense, regulations to mitigate the dangers haven't kept up.
It's something people should have focused on a decade ago when it, wasn't that bad, but now there's really an urgent need to do it.
Deborah Berkowitz is with the National Employment Law Project. She says OSHA has no federal set of guidelines for heat safety at work. Several states have created their own, including California, and in recent weeks, Oregon and Washington.
Having a standard of what employers need to do in terms of acclimatization and hydration, work-rest regimens, I think will really go a long way in making the workplace safer.
The UCLA study found injuries associated with heat decreased after 2005, around the time the state adopted workplace heat rules. I'm Megan McCarty-Carino for Marketplace.
If you've been out to eat lately, like actually sitting down at a restaurant table in person, out to eat, maybe a place you went to in the before times, you probably noticed menus are different now. The actual menus themselves, there's that QR code thing a lot of restaurants are doing. You scan the code and pull up the menu on your phone. But also what is being offered on those menus. There's a lot going on in menus right now. So imagine my relief to be able to get Sean Willard on the phone the other day. He is a professional menu engineer.
Menu engineering, it's the art and science behind menus, and it really pulls from a multitude of fields: behavioral economics, pricing strategy, revenue management, design, color theory. All these things play a factor in how we build menus that are easier for guests to navigate and then more profitable for the operator.
That's so interesting that you guys consider profitability. But anyway, we'll get there in a second. What I wanted to get you on the show to talk about, though, is what the pandemic has done to people in your line of work. Because menus, as we know, have changed both in form and I suspect in function a little bit.
Oh yeah, 2020 was the biggest change to menus ever. And the primary menu has changed from maybe the handheld menu, dine-in menu has now gone to the digital mobile menu. Operators had to make this adjustment very reactionary in the pandemic, and now we're here in 2021 and we can start to build our digital menus a little bit better with what we learned from the pandemic.
Yeah, well, so let me ask you about, what you learned, because you sit down, you scan that QR code. First of all, what did you think when you first heard the whole QR code and people are going to read menus on their phones? What did you, the menu specialist, say to yourself about that?
People do not like looking at menus on their phone.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So the first thing that we work on with teams is making sure that they're formatting well for mobile. Then pictures is something that has really popped up. Third-party delivery platforms have data that shows 50% higher conversions when if a picture is shown versus not. So that's really a big difference there.
So I imagine well, so first of all, QR code menus aren't going away, right? We can huff and puff, and you menu specialists can say it's not as good as the old days, but they're here to stay, right?
Oh yeah, and they're a good thing. For many reasons, they allow operators to be more flexible in their offerings. We can change them almost instantaneously, and we're not printing hundreds of menus that are one-time use, being thrown in the trash or recycled.
In theory, we could have dynamic pricing too, right? I mean, if the beef stroganoff is selling really well, you could bump it up $1.50,
Yes, and that is something that a number of different platforms are working on. That is, how can they have dynamic menus that learn and become a little bit smarter as people use them.
Let me just say, on behalf of the dining public of America, I would like to vote no on that.
Yes, I'm very much in agreement. You know, there's good things and bad things about it. And what it has to be done is if price does go up, we just have to show that there's a time when price does go down as well. Maybe Monday or Tuesday, we might have some type of special.
Right. But also it could be that, you know, if you see the shrimp scampi on the menu in the old days and you really want the shrimp scampi and you order it and the server comes back and says, I'm terribly sorry, we're out, it would just stop appearing on that digital menu, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So when you go out to eat and you either get a QR menu or you get an old-fashioned paper menu that gets handed to you, is it possible for you to dissociate yourself from the actual process of designing that menu, or can you just sit down and have a bite to eat, man?
This is something that I have to work on actively, but it is something that I really do enjoy. I have a passion for it, so I love seeing a menu for the first time. And what I try to do as a customer is find what the restaurant wants me to have. Oh. So that's something we also work on with teams.
Wait, so what's the secret? How do I know what the restaurant wants me to have?
We have different tools that we can use. Boxes is one that's a very good one. But it's not just that. We can add descriptions and share recipes behind them if the chef learned how to cook it from his mother.
Yeah, but do you really believe that when you see it on a menu, or you're like, oh, they're just blowing smoke, man. This guy didn't learn how to cook it from his mother.
You know, I think that there has to be truth in menus, so I would never fabricate that story.
Fair enough. Sean Willard, he's a menu engineer. Sean, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Guy. It's a pleasure.
This final note on the way out today, in which I eat some crow, but do not and will not eat macaroni and cheese ice cream. We told you about this a couple of weeks ago, a joint limited edition mac and cheese ice cream from Kraft and Brooklyn's Van Nuven Ice Creamery. It hit the streets on July the 14th, CNN reports, which it turns out, by the way, is National Macaroni and Cheese Day. Anyway, the stuff sold out like in a day, somehow. I am just going to chalk it up to morbid curiosity myself.
Marketplace is supported by Orca Security. Orca Security detects and prioritizes cloud security risks for AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. More at orca.security. And by Fidelity Wealth Management, helping clients develop a personalized plan to help grow and protect their wealth. Investment minimums apply. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC.
All right, we got to go. Here is your moment of economic context. Bitcoin popped today, up 10% after a rough couple of months. Why? I have no idea. That's kind of my point. Our daily production team includes Anis Amin, Andy Corbin, Richard Cunningham, Real Hot-Horse, Sean McHenry, Daisy Palacios, and Minji Park. It goes down, too, you know, Bitcoin down. I'm Kai Resdall. We will see you tomorrow, everybody. The gender pay gap, yes, that you know about.
What we don't talk often enough about is the more important gender wealth gap.
I'm Kai Risdall, investing in women. Next time, also the numbers from Wall Street and the rest of the day's business news. Coming up on Marketplace.
Tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 and tomorrow evening at 6:30 on KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. I'm Bill O'Grady. We're half a minute away from 7. Here we go. Thank you for spending your time with us at KUOW and NPR. We've been through much together, and we appreciate that you choose KUOW to stay connected, engaged, and informed. If it's been a while since your last contribution to KUOW, please know that your support today sustains our ability to keep you informed in the days and months ahead. Donate online at KUOW.org to keep local journalism strong and thriving. Thank you. Weather outlook for the Seattle area for tonight, low around 60, mostly clear. Tomorrow Tuesday, high around 80 and sunny skies. 94.9 KUOW.
From WHYY in Philadelphia, I'm Terry Gross with Fresh Air. Today, one of the most creative, influential people in the radio and podcast world. We talk with Jad Abumrad, the creator of the public radio series Radio Lab. It started off as a series about science-related mysteries, but now it investigates all kinds of stories. The new Radio Lab miniseries, The Vanishing of Harry Pace, is about the man who co-founded a publication with W.E.B. Du Bois, co-wrote the St. Louis Blues with W.C. Handy, founded the first black-owned record company in 1921, helped desegregate a Chicago neighborhood, and then kind of disappeared. Jad also co-reported the podcast miniseries Dolly Parton's America, which uses her life and music to examine larger issues like America's political and cultural divide. First News.
Live from NPR News, I'm Barbara Klein. The largest active wildfire in California has now burned more than 300 square miles in the northern part of the state. Lucia Starbuck of member station KUNR reports thousands of firefighting personnel are responding.
Part of the Dixie Fire is burning in a remote area with steep terrain, so access is limited, hampering efforts to control the blaze. The fire started burning nearly 2 weeks ago, and over the weekend, it merged with a separate fire. Over the last month, California Governor Gavin Newsom has declared a state of emergency in multiple Northern California counties facing different large fires. And the state has secured federal grants to increase access to firefighting resources. The Dixie Fire is burning in the same county that endured California's deadliest wildfire in 2018. For NPR News, I'm Lucia Starbuck in Reno.
California Governor Newsom has announced as of next month, all state employees and all healthcare workers will be required to be vaccinated against the coronavirus or to get tested weekly.
We are sincere in our belief and desire that we need to step things up at this stage of the pandemic. Our projections are sobering. Our projections over the course of the next number of weeks will show a significant increase in hospitalizations.
California has more than 246,000 state employees and more than 2 million healthcare workers. The country's largest healthcare system, the Department of Veterans Affairs, is also mandating vaccines for all of its frontline medical workers. It'll affect more than 100,000 personnel. The State Department's second highest diplomat has wrapped up a trip to China, telling Chinese officials the U.S. welcomes competition and is not seeking conflict. But as NPR's John Ruwich reports, there appears to have been very little progress in thawing the frosty bilateral relationship.
U.S.-China ties are at their worst in decades, mired in disagreements on trade, human rights, cyber attacks, and other areas. According to the State Department, Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi discussed, quote, ways to set terms for responsible management of the relationship. But according to China's Foreign Ministry, Chinese officials who met Sherman blamed the U.S. for the current state of affairs and presented her with 2 lists of demands. China wants the U.S. to pressure Canada to release a Huawei telecom executive from house arrest. It also wants the U.S. to give visas to Chinese citizens whose families are in the Chinese Communist Party and lift sanctions on state media outlets. John Ruwich, NPR News.
This is NPR. New home sales fell by more than 6.5% in June, the third consecutive month that sales of new single-family homes have sharply declined, and at the lowest level since the early days of the pandemic more than a year ago. In Denver this week, scientists are discussing a link between COVID-19 and a syndrome that resembles Alzheimer's disease. NPR's John Hamilton reports from the Alzheimer's Association International Conference.
COVID-19 can cause brain changes that result in persistent memory loss, confusion, and other symptoms often seen in Alzheimer's patients. So scientists at the conference are trying to learn whether the infection also increases a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's itself. Dr. Gabrielle of UT Health San Antonio is part of an international group studying COVID-19 and affect the brain. And the picture continues to read like a little word. Gabrielle says early evidence suggests
Gross. My guest, Jad Abumrad, is the producer of Radiolab, a nationally broadcast public radio show and podcast that originates from WNYC in New York. He's considered to be a radio genius, like Ira Glass. As evidence, Jad is the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Award. For about 17 years, he co-hosted Radiolab with Robert Krulwich. They started off doing deep dives into science-related stories with highly produced narratives in which the voices were almost scored like music. Composing film scores was Jad's initial aspiration. The show's focus evolved from stories about science-based reality to conflicting versions of truth and reality. Robert Krulwich retired from the show last year. Jad continues to produce the show and co-records Radiolab's mini-series. The podcast series Dolly Parton's America, co-recorded by Jad, won 7 awards, including the Peabody. It used her life, music, theme park, and personality to get to larger issues about messy relationships, women's rights, how the Civil War continues to play out, and how music can bring together people who otherwise might disagree on nearly everything. The new Radiolab miniseries is called The Vanishing of Harry Pace. You may be thinking, Harry who? It's one thing to get people interested in a miniseries about Dolly Parton, but how do you get listeners to believe that a miniseries about a man they've never heard of is worth their time? Here's how. From the opening episode, this is Jad talking about Harry Pace's grandchildren who grew up knowing very little about Pace, except that he was white and probably Italian.
What they discovered is that this man, Harry Pace, whose picture had been hanging on their wall their whole life. Well, first of all, he wasn't Italian. It turns out that he was African American. He was black. That's how he identified. That's how he was seen. And he was someone who literally changed America. In like 19 different ways. Music, culture, theater, housing, law.
He proceeded to fight the case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States.
The decision opened 500 loopholes. He desegregated whole neighborhoods, laid the groundwork for so much music. Like without him.
We have no Robert Johnson.
Please allow me to introduce myself.
No Rolling Stones and no Eric Clapton.
Even had a hand in coining the term rock and roll. I mean, this dude's... Good God, why don't we have like 3 movies about this dude, right? I mean, you know, hello, Ava DuVernay, right? Good God, I mean, this dude is like... He's like the vocational MacGyver. But then somehow, right at the peak of his power, it's like poof. He vanishes. So completely that none of us know his story. Not even his own family. So you're telling me we're related to this unsung hero and you want me to just sit here and laugh about it? I gotta go understand this.
Okay, Jad Abumrad, welcome to Fresh Air. I'm so glad I heard this series. It's really just fantastic. Congratulations on it. And I want to start giving a shout out to Shima Oliai, who co-reports the series with you.
I'm sorry, yeah, Terry, it's just, I just gotta tell you, like, I do what you do, and it's just such an honor to be here, because you are the best, and so I'm just really excited.
Oh, gee, well, thanks. I'm excited to have you. So I just have to say there's so much to talk about with you, and I couldn't figure out how to start exactly. Do you go through that when you're about to start a project? Like, where do you begin? Like, what's the right note to start on?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, the clip that you played was the 12th beginning of the series. Like, we tried so many. I mean, Shima who co-created the project with me, like, we tried every different beginning to that series, and I was smiling when you played it because I thought, oh, that actually works. So many didn't work.
So my doorway into the vanishing of Harry Pace was hearing that he founded Black Swan Records, which was like the first black-owned record company in 1921 to 23, first to record Ethel Waters, first to record the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. I mean, it's just like remarkable recordings, and I'm really interested in music from that period, so I thought like, yeah, I gotta hear this. And then you started taking me in all these other directions, which were equally fascinating, but I was like, not really prepared for it. What was your doorway into wanting to tell the story?
Well, so, you know, you mentioned Dolly Parton's America. So Shima and I had made that series, and one of the voices in that series was a guy named Paul Slade. He's this British music journalist who had told us about Appalachian murder ballads, and it was just sort of a small little wrinkle in that 9-part series. And as we were coming off of that series and looking for something new to do, he reached out and said, "Hey, have you heard of Black Swan Records? I just wrote a book about it." And it was a small Kindle book, and we read it, and we both were just blown away it is one of those stories where you think you're hearing a story about a guy who started a label, but then suddenly you're in the middle of a Supreme Court case about desegregating Chicago's South Side, and then suddenly you're in this very complex, troubling drama about the politics of the color line. It's just one of those stories that cuts across everything.
And just to mention here, like, he starts off being mentored by W.E.B. Du Bois. They found what was probably the first black magazine together. Then he works with W.C. Handy. They found a sheet music publishing company and co-write St. Louis Blues and Beale Street Blues. I mean, it's just a remarkable story. And then there's a whole racial story in there about what color was he really. Embedded in the story is a bit of a personal connection for you. One of the grandsons talks about his racial confusion because he grew up thinking he's white, and now he thinks maybe I'm really black. Like, was my grandfather black? He was very light skinned, but apparently he was really black. But on a census report, he said he was white. So, the grandson is like really confused and asks, like, so what am I? And you say in the podcast that you were asked when you were growing up, so what are you?
Yeah, no, it's a connection that I and my co-creator Shima make very cautiously because, we're both Middle Eastern, and you walk into a room and people think you're one thing, then they hear your name and they think you're another thing, and then they give you that look. It's a look you recognize. What are you? Are you some vaguely ethnic kind of person? And I think of it as the sort of the curse/gift of the in-betweeners, where no one can quite fit you into a box that they've got in their head. That comes with a sort of a irritation and also a little bit of a privilege, depending on which room you're standing in and who you're speaking to. But it's something that it's funny. Every story I tell, it occurred to me in the middle of this project, it has something of that in-betweener spirit in it. People who don't fit, people whose identity or whose work or whose creative spirit somehow doesn't quite sit in the predefined categories. So that was my personal connection, but it's also kind of a professional journey that I just feel like I've been on for the last 20 years.
Your parents immigrated from Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. Was it 82 that they came here?
They came here in 72, actually.
Oh, 72.
So,
okay.
Yeah, just before I was born, and just as the war was really starting to slide into chaos.
In Lebanon.
Yeah.
So you grew up in Tennessee. Your father's a professor of surgery at Vanderbilt?
That's right, yeah.
So were you like a campus kid?
Yeah, I was. My after school was basically hanging out, and so both my parents my mother's a molecular biologist, my dad's a surgeon, and my after school was hanging out in her lab and playing with her lab rats and just sitting there for hours. Or I'd hang out at his at Vanderbilt where he works, and I would play pool with the med students. So yeah, I was kind of the campus kid. I was just sort of like the lab kid who was just always around.
Radiolab initially focused on science. Was part of the reason why you wanted to do that because you grew up partially in this lab? And was science more fun because you had rats? Like you had little animals to watch? It wasn't just like test tubes and textbooks?
Well, yeah, it's funny, I only later did I realize that the rats were, the rats that I would pet and give names to and let them out, put them in my pockets. Only later did I realize that they would later be sacrificed to science. But fast forwarding to those early days of Radiolab where I became kind of essentially a science reporter, part of it was about coming back into the family fold in some sense. I had grown up in the environment of science my entire life, but I didn't really understand what they did. I didn't understand what happens in a lab, the core of my mother's research. I couldn't have explained it to you. And so it was actually really exciting in the early days to ask them questions and to really understand, oh, that's how science works. Interesting. You know, my mother has been studying one protein for almost 40 years, one single protein. And every year she discovers it has some new job that it does. You know, year one, oh, it helps fat get into cells. Year two, oh, it helps you taste things on your tongue. Year three, oh, it's in the heart and it does something about, you know, fatty acids and yada yada. I mean, every year she discovers some new job it has. I had never till that point really stopped to think about that process and to think about the patience and the focus that it takes. And so it was really cool to be a science reporter and then be able to turn to these two people and ask them questions that simultaneously A, helped my work, but B, also explained my childhood in some sense. So, yeah.
I think it's time for a break, so let's take a break here. If you're just joining us, my guest is Jad Abumrad, the creator of the public radio show and podcast Radio Lab. The new Radio Lab miniseries he co-reports is called The Vanishing of Harry Pace. We'll be right back after a short break. This is Fresh Air.
17 minutes past 7, KUOW 94.9. A look at why forests in many parts of the western U.S. are burning bigger and longer on Morning Edition tomorrow morning from 4 to 9. Support for KUOW comes from the Museum of History and Industry, presenting Da Vinci Inventions, a new exhibition on view July 31st featuring full-scale interpretations of his inventions and studies of his art. Info at mohai.org.
I'm Maria Hinojosa. This week on Latino USA, we look at immigration policies under President Biden 6 months into his administration. What's changed and what hasn't?
From the beginning, public health experts have said that there was no real public health justification for the policy.
That's this week on Latino USA.
That's tomorrow evening at 11. Low around 60 tonight, forecast for the Seattle area, mostly clear. Tuesday high around 80 and sunny.
This is Fresh Air. Let's get back to my interview with Jad Abumrad, the creator and producer of the public radio show and podcast Radio Lab. He co-reports the new Radio Lab miniseries, The Vanishing of Harry Pace. He also co-reported the miniseries Dolly Parton's America. So this kind of segues into Dolly Parton, because your doorway into Dolly Parton was in part the fact that she and your father, the surgeon, became friends. So just tell the story of how they met.
Yeah, it's just one of those strange, you know, the universe is stranger than you can imagine kind of moments. So I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and Nashville is Dolly's world. I mean, I guess the world is Dolly's world at this point, but Nashville is like the epicenter of the Dollyverse. And that you walk down the street and she's on a billboard every 3 blocks and you hear her blaring out of cars and she just kind of infuses the air. And that's the world I grew up in. And then it's either 2003 or 2013, I can't remember exactly, but Dolly gets into a minor car crash, is brought to Vanderbilt Hospital, and my dad happens to be on duty at that moment and takes care of her. And she was fine, nothing happened to her. And I guess he checked up on her a few times, and then through that they became friends. Which is, even as I say this to you, Terry, it's the strangest thing, because my dad is he's not the kind of guy that hangs out with famous people or country, like he's this amazing